The confrontation at Adrianople would take place in the Balkans, between Constantinople and the frontier of the Danube. Constantinople was the seat of imperial power in the east and numbered among the empire's most prosperous cities. Founded in 324 by the Emperor Constantine, the city came to bear his name, as well as the set of walls which protected it. The massive, triple-layered Theodosian walls had not yet been built. Regardless, the capital still boasted formidable defenses at this time. 250 miles to the north lay the borders of the empire. In the past, the Romans had pushed beyond the Rhine and Danube to conquer the territories of Germania and Dacia. However, progress east of the Rhine was checked following the disastrous slaughter of 3 legions in the Teutoburger Wald in the 1st century, while the province of Dacia was evacuated of troops in the late 3rd century by Aurelian. The great rivers of the Rhine and Danube were natural features which had long defined the geopolitics of the region. Now, they marked the separation between the empire and the world beyond its borders. Roman engineers set to work fortifying these geographic dividers. Over time, they would develop an extensive set of long, defensive lines. Earth embankments topped by palisade walls connected the many garrisoned military forts positioned along the frontier. Between these were placed minor forts and watchtowers. Careful construction ensured that they took advantage of the terrain, securing mountain passes and river crossings, as well as overlooking important sectors of the opposing bank. Patrols of the border were carried out not only on land, but also on the river by dedicated squadrons of ships. Messages were carried either by horse or fire signal, which helped warn the legions of an impending attack. Ultimately, the fortified defenses would not stop a large, persistent force. But that was not their purpose either. Instead, the walls were meant to be a staging point for the projection of Roman force. A demonstration of overwhelming strength was the best way to defend the empire. This is because strength is an international language. Strength was something that the people beyond the frontier were accustomed to. These German barbarians took part in routine intertribal warfare. Powerful leaders would rise and fall based on their ability to win glory and plunder for their followers. One would need no pretext for war, besides the apparent weakness of a neighbor. This was the way of things, and it had not changed since the times of Julius Caesar. In fact, Caesar notes in his commentaries that the most powerful of German tribes were those which could secure the largest depopulated zones around their territory. It was said that the fiercest among them, the Suebi, were surrounded by over 50 miles of no man's land. The Romans were seen by barbarians as any other neighbor. If the empire appeared weak, for any reason, then raids would soon follow. If these went unchecked, then the attacks would only increase in magnitude. It was important then for Rome to put on the impression of overbearing strength. The presence of the wall and tall watchtowers were one way of achieving this. Another way would be boots on the ground. In response to an attack, the Romans would launch punitive raids against the tribes held responsible. If the situation called for it, then an entire campaign led by field armies and the emperor might be needed to restore order. The frontier walls gave Rome control of all mountain passes and river crossings, which allowed them to effectively carry out these assaults. For years, this type of back-and-forth action characterized life on the frontier. The internal chaos of the 3rd century empire severely weakened the projection of Roman strength beyond the border. However, the relative recovery of the 4th century empire improved its standings, and Rome was able to uphold a banner of strength. The banner might be torn and tattered at times, but at least it remained standing, and with it stood the defenses. For now. In the year 376, a huge group of barbarians amassed at the frontier. They came not to raid, but to enter Roman lands with permission rather than force. Men, women, children, a people on the move. Massive lines of wagons and beasts of burden carried their possessions. They were part of the Tervingi, one of the many Gothic tribes of this period. Opinions are still divided, but it is generally accepted that the Goths had evolved from already existing tribal groups in the area. Quote, they were not a united people, but a loose grouping of distinct tribes speaking a related language, and with many cultural similarities. The evidence suggests that the Goths moved from the Baltic coast to the region of the Black Sea and the southern Danube between the 1st century and the start of the 3rd. End quote. We're not entirely sure why this particular group of Goths was on the move. It is possible that they were fleeing the Huns, who were only just beginning to show their might in Europe and whose presence was only dimly felt by the Romans. Regardless of the circumstances, we do know that such migrations were not uncommon. It seems that the Tervingi believed that a new homeland within the shelter of the empire would provide a better life. As odd as this may seem, it was not a pipe dream, for Rome had a history of admitting such supplicants for the purposes of colonization and recruitment. Entry into the empire was selective. The leading tribal chieftains, Alavius and Fritigern, would have to formally request admission. They did so, and regrouped their people as they awaited a response. The message was sent by courier to the court of Valens, Emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. He was currently stationed in Antioch to deal with the escalating tensions with the Persians. Valens made the political calculation of allowing the Tervingi entry, judging that denying it could lead to a conflict which would distract him from the more pressing eastern matters. It would have taken a month or more for the messengers to cover the more than 1,000-mile round trip back to the frontier. This was a relatively long amount of time for a group of refugees to live off the land. Modern estimates place the numbers at around 10,000 warriors, with about 50,000 women, children, and elderly. The amount of people would surely have stockpiled supplies for their migration, but after a long march and the ensuing wait at the border, a significant portion of these would have been consumed. Shuttling the massive force across the Danube took considerable time and effort. Ferry boats were used as well as ships from the Roman patrol fleet. The number of available vessels was still limited, and the Goths constructed rafts to cross the river or even attempted to swim. Their troubled crossing was only the beginning of the refugees' hardships. Roman authorities in charge of dealing with the Goths were Lupicinus, leader of the Comitatenses in Thrace, and Maximus, leader of the Limitani. Their handling of the situation proved disastrous. Not enough food was supplied to the refugees, who began to starve. While some of the blame can be placed on the limited time the Romans had to stockpile grain for such a large group, a substantial amount can be linked to the sloth, incompetence, and corruption in almost every aspect of the affair. The historian Ammianus tells us that Lupicinus used the high demand for food to charge exorbitant prices for fresh supplies, effectively robbing the new arrivals. According to some sources, the Goths were so desperate that they even began to trade their own children for dog's meat. The Tervingi were marched to the city of Adrianople, where they could better be watched over. Tensions rose, however, when the Tervingi were barred access to the town's market. Lupicinus invited the Gothic leaders to a banquet inside the city, perhaps to see how the situation could be calmed. Meanwhile, a small scuffle between the Goths and a group of soldiers and citizens outside the walls soon escalated into a fight. The troops were routed, and a panicked, perhaps drunk Lupicinus ordered the arrest of the chieftains and an execution of their attendants. Fritigern was released after having seemingly persuaded the Romans that he alone could restore order to the situation. Fritigern quickly rejoined the Goths, who were by this point in an uproar as news of what had transpired spread. Lupicinus gathered all the troops at his disposal and marched out to put the uprising Goths to the sword. Instead, he was met by the furious Tervingi forces who routed his column. Apparently, Lupicinus was amongst the first to flee and escaped alive. A war had just begun in the blink of an eye. The situation quickly snowballed out of control. While the Romans had been distracted by the Tervingi, another migratory tribe known as the Grithungi forced the crossing of the Danube. Previously settled Goths who were near Adrianople and were waiting to be sent to the east also now rose up. These troops defeated the militia force sent against them, plundered their weaponry, and set off to bolster the ranks of the Tervingi and the Grithungi. Yet more Goths came as individuals. Many among them were most likely captives and slaves who now saw a chance to escape. News spread rapidly past the frontier, and additional warbands now streamed across the Danube to join Fritigern. The Gothic force grew increasingly powerful. New additions to the force were made of eager, armed warbands rather than the migrating non-combatants. Additional pillaging also brought better equipment. Quote, "The pressure of the situation, surviving in enemy territory month after month, cemented the authority of their leaders and their ability to work together." End quote. They may have become overconfident and attempted a failed siege of Adrianople. The Goths, however, lacked the skills and supplies to carry out a proper assault on fortified cities. Fritigern is supposed to have concluded that he kept peace with walls. This was the only silver lining for the Romans. The inability of the Goths to take large cities meant that the barbarians could not take strategic control of the area and were left to wander the countryside. Not that this was any consolation to the populace stuck outside the walls. The barbarians had to feed themselves by constantly raiding and foraging throughout Thrace. Staying concentrated in one place too long would rapidly exhaust the available food supplies. The Gothic forces were therefore forced to split up into smaller groups. Doing so, however, made them vulnerable to attack. Valens recognized the immediacy of the problem and negotiated a hasty peace treaty with the Persians in 377. He also called for the assistance of Gratian, emperor of the Western Roman Empire. While both sides amassed their main field armies, a smaller, mixed force was sent to deal with the threat as best they could. While the Goths split up, this Roman army was able to destroy several isolated groups. In retaliation, the Goths shredded multiple Roman units outside the city of Dueltum in modern Bulgaria. A larger confrontation took place near the town of Ad-Salices, where a substantial number of Goths had gathered. Fierce fighting ensued. The Roman left was broken, and the situation only stabilized with the commitment of reserve forces. This battle ended in the stalemate, but saw a withdrawal of the Roman army. By late summer, Valens had readied his force and was awaiting Gratian's arrival. The Western Emperor had been delayed by his own barbarian incursions, but assured Valens that he would soon arrive, and together they would take on the Goths. The Eastern Emperor would not prove so level-headed. In July, Valens sent ahead the senior general Sebastianus with 300 men from each of the legions. This advanced force was tasked with clearing out some smaller Gothic bands lingering around Adrianople. The legionnaires were successful in their objectives, recovering much of the plunder that the barbarians were hauling away with them. Preparations were then made for the arrival of the main force. A camp was built outside the town with a ditch and rampart topped by wooden stakes. The main Roman army soon arrived, approaching in a protective square formation. This force was comprised of 3 field armies, the army of Thrace and the first and second armies of the Emperor's presence. Valens settled this force into the camp and was soon joined by Ricomeres, commander of Gratian's household guard. Ricomeres brought a letter, once again assuring the Emperor of the impending arrival of the Western troops. Valens called a war council. Subordinate commanders and important advisors were summoned to discuss the question of whether or not to attack immediately. Numerous senior officers advised caution, reminding the Emperor once again that Gratian was only a few days away. Victor, the Sarmatian-born master of horse, was among the most ardent in stressing this point. However, the discussion was by no means one-sided. The general, Sebastianus, and other hawkish leaders urged immediate action. The final decision rested with the Emperor. On the 9th of August, 378, Valens marched the main eastern army out of Adrianople alone. He seems to have made the seemingly reckless decision for a couple reasons. The first reason was that a recent peace delegation sent by Fritigern showed that perhaps the Goths were nervous for battle. Maybe, if the Roman Empire once again spoke the language of true strength, then the Goths would back down and submit without bloodshed. The second reason for Valens' decision was the report from his scouts, which estimated the enemy numbers at around 10,000 men. This obviously did not represent the entirety of the Gothic force and indicated that it was only a detachment. Apparently the enemy was making its way through the hill passes 15 miles to the north. However, they were not in battle order and were instead slowly moving ahead with wagon trains filled with their families. The Emperor was emboldened. Here was a chance to strike a decisive blow to an isolated and unprepared element of the enemy force. Delaying any longer would only give the Goths the chance to group up together and grow stronger, making it substantially harder to overawe them into submission. The third reason Valens may have sought battle was pride. Our sources claim that Valens was eager for battle and did not want to share the glory of a victory with anyone else. He is said to have been particularly jealous of his nephew Gratian's military successes against the Alemanni, and was maybe even jealous of Sebastianus' own successes on the road to Adrianople. The near-universal damnation of Valens' decision to advance alone is disingenuous and is made with the benefit of hindsight. Simply put, we have no way to judge whether Valens had a better chance fighting a smaller, unprepared Gothic force, or if together both emperors had a better chance fighting a much larger and more prepared force. We should also be wary of the Roman historians' desire to find a scapegoat for major defeats, as was the case with Varro at Cannae. It is almost too convenient to simplify this battle into another fable about the dangers of excessive Roman pride. History is history, and we need not fuss over the hypotheticals. Valens acted on the faulty intel of his scouts and gambled on a quick victory. Where we can fault him, however, is that he did not hedge his bets.